Welcome! Today we will look at some teaching techniques that can be used to teach history standards focusing on the colonization and independence of Africa. The first history standard in Social Studies Grade 7 asks students to look at the continuity and change in Africa. Part A focuses on the European partitioning and its effects. Part B focuses on the Pan-African movement and how nationalism led to independence. Some lesson ideas include a simulation using candy, a map study, and individual research using BBC resources. Let's start with the simulation activity. This simulation will most likely take a full class period and does take some prep ahead of time. First, you will need to get several bags of individually wrapped candy. Consider items that will stay wrapped when handled. Then, prepare yourself. This activity can get a little exciting. Finally, in class, have students prepare by taking out a sheet of paper and writing utensil. Start the activity with an introduction to the students. Read the 2 rules to your students. Try not to elaborate. Let the students use their imagination some. Second, spread candy around the room on the floor. Make sure none of the candy lands directly on a student's desk. Your class will have one of 2 reactions. One possibility is that the students will dive on the floor and start collecting the candy. The second possibility is that the students will start to gather candy and then stop because they think that they shouldn't. If the second possibility occurs, simply refer back to the rules and say that these are the only rules. Eventually, all of the candy will be collected by the students. When this happens, direct students back to their desks with their candy. At this point, start referring to the candy as resources. Once students have returned to their seats, have students inventory what they have collected and answer the 3 questions. The first question should be answered in detail. For instance, I received 4 mints, 3 butterscotch, etc. Students are usually very honest at the start of class. Once they have answered this question and there is a record of what they have, there is little opportunity for students to eat their candy or steal from others. Discuss as a class what happened. Who got a lot of candy? Why? Who has no candy? Why didn't they have any? There is usually one person in each class who does not have any candy. This is usually a good thing later in class. Was there a tussle for the candy? Did someone do something crazy like take off a shirt to fill it with candy? Once the situation has been discussed, it's time to explain the purpose of the activity. In this activity, the teacher is Africa and the students represent European countries. Why did the students, Europe, take Africa, the teacher's resources? Basically, the students will say that they wanted the candy, so they picked it up. This is essentially what Europe did. They saw resources that they wanted, and they took the resources. The candy did not belong to the students, it belonged to the teacher. The students saw that this was valuable. It is worth pointing out to students that they would not have had the same reaction if the teacher had walked around emptying the trash can on the floor. The students were willing to act because they saw value. Europe saw value in Africa in resources, land, people. This is obviously an oversimplification, but it gets the point across. Who has the power in the situation? The students, Europe, had the power. Once students started taking the candy, there's little the teacher could physically do to stop them. The students outnumbered the teacher. Europe held power over Africa in technology, including weaponry. Was there fighting between the students for the candy? There's usually at least some minor pushing in the process. This can be compared to the fighting that started between European countries. In fact, Europe had to come up with rules during the Berlin Conference. This basically set up procedures for European countries to colonize parts of Africa in a way that there would not be fighting amongst the Europeans. Now is a good time to focus on students who did not get any candy. This is also like Europe in that not all European countries took over land in Africa. At the same time, not all European countries took over equal resources or land, just like Europe. Some countries colonized more land than others. After a full class discussion, allow students time to write about the activity. Having a chance to write will help students solidify their understanding and will give the teacher a chance to find any misconceptions that students have. Next, explain to the class that for the next part of the activity, we will need to form groups. Have students put their resources on their paper to take with them. The only real requirement is that we will need more than one group. Tell students to consider a group that they would like to work with. Who can you get along with? Maybe you could consider your resources. Once groups are formed, have students sit down and answer the next group of questions. After students have had a chance to write, take a few student responses about how they like their groups and why they picked the groups they did. Most will boil down to, I picked this group because I like these people. Next, inform the students that new groups will be needed. The teacher should move students around to new groups. The goal in creating these groups is to make as many students as unhappy as possible. Split up best friend groups. Put students that are enemies together. It's okay if they protest. This will be useful later. If you have a student who loves to be alone, put them in a large group. Take your most talkative student and put them in a group by themselves. Once students are thoroughly mixed up, have them reflect on the new groups by answering questions. Allow time for students to express their thoughts about the new teacher groups. The overall consensus should be that the students are not as happy with the teacher groups as they were with the groups of their choosing. Now it is time to explain what the grouping part of this activity has to do with Africa. Now the roles have been switched. The teacher is representing Europe, and the students are now Africa. Did the teacher consider the happiness of the students when forming groups? No. In fact, when Europe partitioned Africa, they did not take ethnic groups or prior rivalries into account. This means that sometimes tribes who hated each other now found themselves in the same country. Refer back to the students that complained about having to be in a group together. What were the results of the new groups? Was there conflict in the class? In fact, this was what happened in Africa. Many wars and conflicts in Africa today can be traced back to the European partitioning of Africa. Not only was there increased conflict, but some people were separated from their resources. This will happen with at least one student when making groups. They started in a group with a lot of resources, or candy, but ended up in a group with few resources. Since Europe did not consider resources when creating borders, tribes could have been separated from historical resources when Europe drew new country borders. After this explanation, have students write about the groups and what they have to do with Africa and Europe. This step is important because it gives students a chance to solidify their learning. While students are writing, take time to clean up. The teacher can collect the candy without too much argument during this time because the students are busy. It may also be a goodwill gesture to offer students one piece of candy to keep and eat. It's also a good idea to read over students' answers from the day as a way to discover misconceptions that students have about the activity and those historical times in Africa. Another idea to examine the colonization of Africa is a map review. This is an example of a map that you can use to discuss the topic. Students can be provided with a copy of the map and asked to make observations. What European countries colonized land in Africa? Which countries controlled the most land? The least? What did the white sections of the map represent? What present-day countries do these represent? Is all of the land colonized by each country continuous, or is the land divided around the continent? After observations have been made, allow students to draw some conclusions from their observations. Why do you think the nations of Ethiopia and Liberia stayed independent? And why do you think that each country's colonies are not continuous? Why does Portugal, for instance, have colonies spread around the coast of Africa? This is a great opportunity for a think, pair, share. Have each student think and brainstorm individually. The students should jot down their thoughts and ideas. Then, have pairs of students discuss their ideas to expand their thoughts. Ultimately, all pairs share their thoughts as part of a class discussion. If students struggle with ideas, the teacher can provide hints and tips. It would also be helpful for students to have some additional resources to refer to during this process. Having students write their final conclusions after the class discussion will allow students to firm up their ideas and give you, the teacher, a sense of understanding and misconceptions. A way to examine how nationalism led to independence in Kenya and Nigeria, it's important for students to understand the historical events of each country. This may be a good place for some individual student research. One resource that could be beneficial here is the BBC. The BBC website obviously has a ton of information, but using their search bar, I searched Nigeria, several things come up. One of them is the Nigeria country profile. This is what we want to look at today. As you scroll down on this page, you'll see a lot of information about the country as a whole. Some information about population, religion, life expectancy, their current leader. One of the things that would be helpful in a history timeline and a history study is this timeline. You'll see some major events that took place and the years when they did take place. This information is available on every country in the world. So if we can also look at Kenya, we will see that they also have a country profile. So a good place to find information, at least to start, is this BBC website. Once again, we have our timeline with some key events in history. I hope this can be helpful to you and your students. As we conclude, remember to include a variety of activities in your unit to meet different learning styles. Feel free to use or modify these activities to meet your teaching style and students. Good luck as you plan your upcoming Africa unit.